5 minutes on life in the Soviet Union. I think the theme of what Barbara said about the isolation is the key word, I would say, of what we experienced there. It was a world such as I think does not exist anymore. Perhaps North Korea, I don't know, I haven't been there. But it was really, this total isolation was the biggest burden, I think, for someone from the West living in Moscow. Otherwise, the fact is we led fairly privileged lives as diplomats. I mean, we had food even imported from Stockholm, from Stockmann's. We could shop in special stores that were set up for foreigners and so on. We compared to the average Soviet, we can't say, I think, that we suffered really. But it was the element of isolation and the element of sort of control that was extraordinary. For example, we were there when Ronald Reagan was shot, and the television announced that Ronald Reagan had been shot. But then they did not know how to handle this, what else they could say in the TV studio. For the next 8 hours, there was not a word on whether he was alive, whether he was dead, whether the assailant was apprehended. They just did not know how to handle the story. And thus, we really did not know what happened. We did not know if he was alive or dead for 8 hours, because they just would not carry this. The TV announcers did not know what line to take in presenting this to the people. And this element of control and isolation was really, sometimes people ask me about the inevitable question of the KGB. What were the KGB tactics? Were you harassed and so on? The amazing thing about the KGB was how sophisticated they were, to my mind. It was psychologically a very sophisticated strategy that they had toward diplomats. For example, they wanted to foster the isolation of their own people from foreign diplomats. They did not want diplomats talking to the average Russian whom they might meet when they were traveling or something like that. They wanted to keep that barrier. So what did they do? Well, in my time, for example, there was an incident of two Japanese diplomats from the Japanese embassy who were traveling, and they were in a city in a hotel, and there was a Soviet wedding party going on, and the father of the bride came over and insisted that they have a drink in honor of his daughter. Of course, they could not resist. They had a drink. They became violently ill that evening. They had to return to Moscow. It was clear that the drink that they had been given something intentionally to become ill. What happened was, word of this spread through the diplomatic community instantly. And the next time somebody was traveling and a Soviet person offered you a drink, you turned it down. And you probably reinforced the KGB notion that, boy, those foreigners are very unfriendly, and they're not very nice people. They won't even accept the drink from you. But people did that because they did not want to have the same thing happen to them. It was a very sophisticated way of trying to keep you from getting to know or to establishing contact with the average Soviet. Just one other instance, and what the Soviets did also to try to increase your own vulnerability as diplomats. Of course, we had a lot of protection as diplomats from the KGB and so on. But we all lived in apartment houses that were basically Soviet-run, and the Soviets could come in and out. And what was routine, at least in the American embassy, is you would come home one evening, and a lamp, which had always been on that table on that side of the room, was on that table on that side of the room. And it was purposely, it was very intentional to remind you of your vulnerability, and that somebody had been there, and that they could have done something much worse if they wanted to. And yet it was at such a level that you could not complain about it. You would not go to the foreign ministry and say, somebody moved a lamp in my apartment from one table to another. It would be absurd to do that. And they knew how to push this exactly to the level where you would get the message that they are there, that they can do things to you, and yet to do it at a level where it was almost impossible to complain about it or to do anything about it. And this was commonplace. It happened to all of the people in the embassy. And some of them, the people who were harassed, who were really sort of intentionally harassed, were generally the people who worked with the dissidents or who had certain jobs like that in having contacts with the dissidents and so on. And to them, they could do much worse things. There was a whole gradation of things that could be done. Some people had their freezers unplugged when they were on vacation, and which was serious. You could lose hundreds of dollars worth of food or damage done to some of your things. But what I found interesting was just the moving the lamp from one table to another. And some people were really psychologically affected by this. I mean, by this sense that you did not know, you did not have control over your own living space. Some people it didn't bother. But anyway, it was definitely a tactic that was employed. Probably I'm 5 minutes over, right? 5 minutes on policy. I was there during my first tour in Moscow in a very dramatic time when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan 6 months after I arrived, and then I was there through the boycott of the Moscow Olympics and through all of the sanctions that were imposed. It was a very dramatic, a very difficult time in U.S.-Soviet relations. What policies, sometimes people ask, what policies were effective, what policies were not? Could we affect Soviet behavior? In my own view, we really could not. We affected it only marginally, I would say. The policies we intended to use were effective only on the margins in terms of the actions that the Soviets themselves wanted to take. You take the example of Afghanistan, which is perhaps a dramatic example. Détente did not deter the invasion of Afghanistan. The sanctions that we imposed afterwards did not really do very much, I think, in influencing Soviet behavior subsequently. Some people argue that they may have deterred the Soviets then in moving into Poland because Solidarność then developed shortly thereafter. I'm rather skeptical about that. I think the Soviets did not go into Poland because the Polish example was not infectious. It was not spreading to other countries, and it was destroying the Polish economy and so on. So they did not have to do that. I think our own policies were, and we can talk about this some more during the discussion, were not particularly effective in influencing Soviet behavior. But I think there were two trends, really, which definitely did have impact. They were in part our policies, but in part they were developments in the world at large. The first one, I think you could credit in part to Jimmy Carter, and that was the human rights issue which developed. And this is particularly, it developed, and I worked on that a lot, with the Helsinki Final Act, with CSCE, OSCE, the whole development of the human rights issue. And I say it was only partly to our credit that this worked because, in fact, we in the West, or at least the United States, did not expect the reaction that the Helsinki Final Act had, of all of these Helsinki monitoring groups being created spontaneously all over Eastern Europe. It was an incredible phenomenon, which of course we grabbed onto and welcomed, but we did not expect it. It was very much, to a large degree, an indigenous development. And, but it did have definitely impact because the Soviets never quite developed an effective counter to the human rights criticism. they tried various things: non-interference in interference in internal affairs, then counter-criticism of Western human rights policies. But they never developed an effective counter. And the human rights issue grew the whole time, I think, throughout my career. And it exerted pressure, I think, from the bottom in the Soviet Union. It did start exerting that very gradually. The second development, I think, which sort of was a policy, and this I would credit a little bit to Ronald Reagan, was the issue of the high-tech revolution. This started in the 70s, the computer age. It really started, we don't remember now, it started very quickly. It began developing computers everywhere. The Soviets saw this. They saw this phenomenon. And they were very worried about it. They were very worried. They saw how computers were taking off in the West, how kids were growing up learning computers. And then came the big thing, which was ridiculed at the time, SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative of Ronald Reagan, which at the time was very controversial. Of course, Reagan was sort of ridiculed for it. But I can tell you, the Soviets took it seriously, and they were terrified of it. I had numerous conversations. They were very scared that something like this would develop, because they knew that the real source of their strength was the nuclear weapons that they had, and that they did not have the strength otherwise to compete with the West. And so whether SDI is possible or is not possible, it had a dramatic effect, I think, in various currents that developed that led to a Mikhail Gorbachev deciding that there had to be a fundamental change in the Soviet Union. Last point, and I won't even make it 5 minutes. The collapse of the Soviet Union. Often I'm asked, well, did you see this coming? Could you see this coming? I mean, this was perhaps, I think it's the most significant historic event in my lifetime. I think. It's probably a unique development almost in history, because I cannot think of an example in history when an empire willingly dissolved itself. And that is, in effect, what happened in the Soviet Union, when it sort of peacefully, willingly gave up the empire. I did not see it coming. I don't think anyone saw it coming. And people ask, well, how is this possible? We gave millions to the CIA, to analysts. This was the most watched phenomenon in the world. Well, the answer is you could not see it coming. You could not see it coming because, by definition, if you could see it coming, people would have stopped it. People would have averted it. It was something that came very much from the top. It came from Gorbachev. And nobody could predict what Gorbachev would do. The real irony is that nobody saw it coming, not even Gorbachev, because he did not think that the Soviet Union would come apart. So if Gorbachev himself did not anticipate what his actions would bring, how could a poor analyst in the CIA have surmounted that is what would happen? I think it's always very unfair that people criticize that we could not see this coming. But nonetheless, it was an incredible development that, I would never have predicted. And I certainly would never have predicted that it would happen as peacefully as it did. We all know there were conflicts. I worked on them subsequently in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Moldova. There were regional wars. But I also worked at the time, or later, I worked on Yugoslavia. And I sometimes think, compare the dissolution of Yugoslavia with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And it is counterintuitive. Yugoslavia was the poster child of the West for much of the post-war period. The Soviet Union was the evil empire. And yet the Soviet Union dissolved relatively bloodlessly, while Yugoslavia had this tragic, incredible civil war. And you often ask, well, why is this? Why did this happen? And I can tell you my answer, it's the quality of political leadership. And when people sometimes ask me, what have you learned in your 32 years in the Foreign Service? I say it is the importance of the quality of leadership on the fate and the destiny of nations. And I think you see it in a case like this, where I think Gorbachev, who is one of the truly great figures of our time, and Yeltsin to some degree, allowed this thing to happen peacefully, whereas Yugoslavia had the tragic misfortune to have some leaders who led it down a terrible, irresponsible path. And the country suffered so dramatically for it. We all wish that they had had different leaders. And it happened that way. So the lesson I have learned is the importance of the quality of leadership really in foreign affairs. It's incredible.